Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive video review of the new Canon EOS R6 Mark II. Now, the EOS R5 and R6, in my mind, were the breakthrough cameras for Canon on the full-frame mirrorless space. Prior to that, both the EOS R and the EOS RP had serious shortcomings, but the R5 and the R6 showed that Canon was ready to compete on a merit-based level with competitors from either Sony or Nikon. A few years have passed now, but we see that the R6 is the first of these models to get a Mark II version, or a second generation. And what I have found is that there are some clear, obvious improvements on paper, but overall, what my takeaway is from the R6 Mark II is this is a camera that has gotten a lot of additional polish in going into that second generation. And so some of the shortcomings of the original R6 have certainly been resolved here, along with some key headline improvements, including a new 24 megapixel sensor, a faster burst rate, which is up to 40 frames per second, and electronic shutter mode, which is blazing fast, obviously. Next generation focus, largely inherited from the high-end EOS R3, and improved video specs as well. So is this the mid-level camera to buy at a price tag of around $2,500 US? Today's review is about discovering the answer to that question, and we'll dive right into it right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So the first thing that stands out about the R6 Mark II is how familiar it feels. And really, that's a good thing. This is a camera that you can immediately become familiar with one major exception. Its overall dimensions are very, very similar to that of the R6, with just a little bit less weight to it. But this is a camera that, if you have been using any of Canon's full-frame mirrorless bodies, is going to feel very familiar in the hand. It's got a great grip. I will note, unlike a lot of Sony cameras, there's enough room there that even when you're using a fairly wide lens, your knuckles are not rubbing up against it. So I really love the grip there. I also like both of the optical interfaces here. We have a 3.69 million dot EVF, and the thing that stands out to me about Canon's EVF is that at the moment right before you take a photo, it doesn't have that kind of blurry quality that happens to Sony's EVFs. I use Sony cameras all the time. I really like them, but that's one thing that it kind of puzzles me, that even in the high-end Alpha 1, the viewfinder itself gets just kind of squirrely right at the moment when you're half depressing the shutter before you take the image. Canons don't do that, and so it's a little bit more of an engaging experience through the EVF. We also have a 3-inch fully articulating 1.62 million dot EVF touchscreen, and the touchscreen itself, as always for Canon, is very responsive. It's a genuine joy to use, something that Canon has done really well for quite a long time. Beyond that, there are relatively few changes to the overall button placement and ergonomics of the previous generation camera. There's also a minor change to the joystick that is now curved out rather than curved in. Not sure it's a positive change, however, because it seems like the other was a little bit easier to distinguish from buttons around it by feel because of the unique curved-in design on it. There continues to be dual UHS 2 card slots, no change there. The ports on the left side are virtually the same, and unfortunately a negative there is that we continue to have just a micro HDMI port. And for a camera that does have quite decent video specs, going to that standard I think is going to be a disappointment for many people that would be looking for a little bit more of a robust port for HDMI there. We are utilizing the same battery and battery grip, though I will note that battery life has been improved through some wizardry to where you're now getting up to 760 shots per charge, and very often you'll actually get better than that. I found the battery life to be really robust. One negative I did find, however, is that rather than many other cameras that seem to be getting more and more standardized that you can charge the battery inside the camera, now we have gone away from that. And the USB-C port, it requires an adapter if you're actually going to charge battery in camera. So that's a step back from what I've seen in some previous model, not a change that I personally like. There are some improvements to the communications there in the USB slot, including the ability to connect directly to a phone via a MiFi rated cable, and so you can have direct control of the camera from a phone, which obviously removes some of the sometime glitchiness that comes with a wireless type connection. Also, you can use it directly as a 1080p webcam, obviously an advantage thing, and the Wi-Fi standard is slightly improved where you're getting a little bit faster communication. Now, something that is both a positive and a negative is that we now have a dial that allows you to switch between a movie setup for the camera and a still setup for the camera. So you can obviously have unique custom buttons, unique menu settings, depending on which of those modes you're in. But unfortunately, Canon chose to put that exactly where they had the on-off switch before, and the overall feel of the switch is very similar. So those of us that have a lot of muscle memory, for example, I've owned the EOS R5 for years now, I'm very familiar with reaching to what feels like a very familiar switch to turn the camera on and off, only to discover that rather than turning it on or off, I'm actually just switching between stills and video. They have moved the on-off switch over to the right side of the camera here on top with lock in between. Some would argue that that makes more sense to allow you to have a one-handed turning on, one-handed control there as you grab the camera. Though it is somewhat of an awkward, it requires you using a kind of your forefinger to come up here to reach it. Frankly, I preferred the on-off switch where it was. I would have preferred them put the switch between video and stills over here rather than have something that is completely different in terms of the ergonomics and the muscle memory from all of the other cameras that Canon has. So not crazy about that. Also, I will note that just as a general observation on the system, that Canon continues to remain closed to third-party lenses. And that's something that is a serious consideration if you're thinking about buying a camera from Canon as opposed to any other brand. I will note, for those of you that have watched over the years and watched my reviews of the Samyang 14mm f2.8 and then also 85mm f1.4 lenses that Samyang is no longer producing because of Canon, I think, probably threatening them for using those protocols. They do continue to work on the R6 Mark II, at least for this point, and so I was very happy to see that. One of the major improvements that we've already highlighted here is an improvement to the overall shutter performance. Now, while we continue to have 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, which frankly is about as good as we're seeing from any camera at this point, we can now go up to 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Also with the electronic shutter, your shutter speed limit goes from 1/8,000th of a second to 1/16,000th of a second. Now, there is a slightly reduced buffer depth compared to the original R6, probably because we have a larger sensor and so more information going through the pipeline. And so there is a limit if you're shooting at the 40 frames per second to where you're only going to get about 2 seconds of a burst. However, I did find I could use compressed RAW or C-RAW and dramatically improve that buffer depth. For example, in this sequence, I fired off 89 shots, very, very quick, 40 frames per second, zero problems, no slowdown. I could have gone for much further with that. There's also a new feature called RAW Burst Mode that, when enabled, it begins to take shots even before you fully depress the shutter, making sure you catch that moment that you might have otherwise missed. It records at 30 frames per second and so gives you a lot of frames to choose from even before that crucial moment when you press the shutter. If you're shooting with just recording in JPEGs, by the way, you're not going to have any kind of issues with buffer depth. You can get 1,000 plus without any issue there. And so in many ways, there are some limitations and that buffer is reduced a bit. It's not going to be as robust, particularly if you want to shoot full raw images, compared to a dedicated sports camera like the R3. However, this does really excel as a budget sports camera because really if you're going to shoot in C-RAW, which I often do, you really don't have a lot of limitations in terms of buffer depth. And obviously you have amazing autofocus, which we'll get to in just a second, and you have that really fantastic burst rate to draw from. The autofocus system here, as noted, continues to evolve and improve. It inherits a lot of the technology that went into the R3's autofocus. So that gives us autofocus coverage over basically 100% of the frame in both the horizontal and vertical axes. I found that tracking is sticky and intuitive. I also really like the visual engagement that comes with Canon's focus system here. You can really see what tracking is doing, and it gives you some options right on screen to make some changes, to maybe switch over to a different eye, for example. And so it gives you some options right there. I found, obviously, in that basketball sequence that tracking was effortless, even going through mixed light over multiple shots, very clean results. I did try to go into a butterfly conservatory and try to track that action, and I found that to be a really challenging subject. The behavior and the flight patterns of butterflies is really kind of erratic, and you could tell that the focus system wasn't nearly as adept at tracking that as it is tracking birds or human activity. At the same time, however, I suspect that this is probably a fairly common problem. It's not a scenario I've shot in a lot, and I'm sure that I could improve my technique as well. But there is certainly still going to be some limits to tracking depending upon your subject matter. I did find very few limits, however, when it came to tracking action in event settings. It didn't seem to matter what direction the face was. It just did a flawless job. And as I went through image after image of shooting, I just found that all of them were perfectly focused. So I was very impressed with autofocus performance. I also found that the low light performance was very good. It is sensitive down to about -6.5 EV, which is obviously very good. And so in very limited lighting situations, for example, this bookshelf and essentially a dark room, I was able to focus without any slowdown. What really impressed me is actually I went out to shoot astro with the camera, and without realizing I was still in autofocus mode. And as I depressed the shutter, thinking I was just going to actually begin to pull up an on-screen distance scale, I actually saw that it autofocused, and it correctly autofocused on a star point, which is something that I've almost never seen. So I was very impressed by that. Also, there's a new feature here that I really love, and I dearly hope that Sony copies this feature, and that is that there is an auto subject detection. I've really found in times past, particularly with Sony, that if you have the wrong subject enabled, it can really play havoc with the focus system and its kind of learning abilities. Being able to have that auto detection here means that I really didn't have to worry about selecting whether I was shooting a human subject, animal subject, bird, a plane car, etc. It just, instinctively drew on the right subject, and I found that it worked well enough that I never felt like I needed to switch there. And so I was really impressed by that feature, and it's something that I'm really glad to see Canon implement. I also found that video AF was exceptionally good, very good stickiness and tracking, eye subject, and a lot of that same tracking technology that I saw in stills is carrying on to the video side as well. Overall, we have a great focus system, and if you're using C-RAW, this is essentially, or JPEG, this is essentially an extremely effective sports camera on a budget. Speaking of video, we have some improved video specs, both in the specifications, but also in the overall performance of the camera. First of all, we now have 4K 60 available to us with 6K oversampling. And that allows you to get a full sensor readout without any kind of crop factor when you are shooting in 4K 60, which is something like a competing camera, the A7 IV. It has definitely a crop factor that makes it changes your angle of view if you want to shoot in 4K 60. That's not the case here, so I like that. There is, however, an APS-C mode available, and so that allows you to use EFS or RFS mount crop sensor lenses, or just to get more reach if you want to change for that framing. But on the practical side, there's a few things that really just help boost the performance in general. And that, first of all, is that Canon seems to have done something to fully resolve the overheating issues. And so that just doesn't seem to be a problem at this point. Also, we no longer have any kind of recording limit. And when you're wanting to shoot kind of slow motion action, you can actually shoot up to 180 frames per second in full HD to really get slow motion, as you can see in this shot of just water falling into a sink. You also continue to have specs like C-Log3 or HDR-PQ, and I'm reminded of the fact that it doesn't seem like all that long ago where I was paying Canon $100 to just add C-Log to my 5D Mark IV. Now it's just kind of second nature that features like that and more are included in these cameras. We've come a long way. You can also output 6K ProRes RAW files to an Atmos Ninja recorder, and so that just gives you another option there. Canon also has implemented a focus breathing compensation, similar to what Sony has, though at this stage it is limited to certain lenses. And unfortunately, I didn't have any of those lenses on hand. Kind of surprisingly, the 24-105 f4 LIS that I used, for a lot of this review is not one that's on that list at this moment, though I suspect that they will broaden that in the future. Much like what is available in the RAW burst mode, where you can kind of pre-record before you fully engage the shutter, you also have a similar option like that for capturing video that is going to always just give you a few extra seconds of recording beforehand just to make sure that you get that crucial shot. So a lot of positive things on the video front here as well. As noted, we have an all-new 24-megapixel CMOS sensor. Now, Canon already did have a 24-megapixel sensor in the EOS R3. That, however, was a stacked sensor. This is not a stacked sensor. It is an all-new sensor. And what I found is that we have slightly improved dynamic range, slightly better ISO performance. It delivers really highly detailed images for a 24-megapixel sensor. 24 megapixels is not all that impressive as a resolution point. However, it is 4 megapixel higher than what the original R6 was, but because of this newly designed sensor and its ability to capture more detail, I think that you would probably see a little bit more detail and a little bit better improvement to resolution than even what that 4 megapixels suggests. As before, we have no MRAW or LRAW, smaller file size options here when it comes to RAW images. We just have the compression options there. At 24 megapixels of sensor, that's probably less of an issue, I would suspect. We'll dive in, we'll take a closer look at the sensor performance, and so you can see what I'm talking about for yourself.
So let's start by looking at what is a typical Canon strength for its sensors, and that is great color rendition. You can see from this shot that obviously we've got really beautiful detail in it, but as you look at the colors, there's just something that's really pleasing. There's a nice level of saturation. This is a raw image with basically no editing to it at all. But at the same time, colors are not like oversaturated or over garish. The other thing that Canon claims about this new sensor is that it's able to produce really high resolution images, or high detailed images, I should say, even at its 24 megapixel level. And so they claim it actually produces detail better than, say, the 30 megapixel sensor on the 5D Mark IV. I no longer have a 5D Mark IV to make that direct comparison, but I will say this, it definitely produces some of the finest detail that I've seen from a 24 megapixel sensor, and I've reviewed a lot of them. This is at f1.4 and obviously a shot of myself, and you can see that there really is a lot of detail there. Now obviously you're not going to go in as many pixels in terms of the kind of zoom going to a pixel level, but detail is really strong. Here's another one from the 35mm f1.4L Mark II lens via adapter EF mount lens. And you can see it's a sharp lens. You can see little great detail there on Nala's face. And then, as I talked about, just kind of the general color and impression of the lens, it produces a really nice result. Here's in an event setting. This is using the 24-105 f4L IS, and so you can see that the detail is really fantastic. The colors are really pleasing. It just worked really well in an event setting. In terms of the focus, it was just flawless for its focus and just really delivered nice looking results. And this is all shot at ISO 3200, which you can see. You would never know that. It is completely clean. There's really nothing to point to, even as far as noise, to say, oh, that's a high ISO shot. So according to Photons to Photos, we have got roughly 11.5 stops, just right over that of dynamic range, which puts this definitely in the top 5 of all-time Canon sensors. Canon's best sensor by their chart test are right under 12 stops of dynamic range. And by the way, this is not just kind of the marketing hype that some people put out, camera manufacturers, but this is, their actual test under real kind of more real world conditions. And so that's a really, really strong performance that actually compares fairly favorably with a lot of sensors from other companies as well. So here's a look at a correctly exposed image. We'll take a look first at underexposing to see how it holds up in terms of shadow recovery as a part of dynamic range. So here we have the correct exposure here. This is a 3-stop of underexposure here on the right that has been recovered. I'll show you the before image in just a moment. But taking a quick look at the shadow area, we can see that we've recovered without any kind of ugly noise. There's no discoloration anywhere. The image looks really, really clean up here in the color swatches. 3 stops, literally no problem. You would never know that this is a recovered image there on the right. Here's 4 stops, and you can see that we're still recovering very, very cleanly. If we take a look in here close at the timer face, no noise to see there. Looking in the shadow area, I don't see any noise. I don't see any discoloration or banding. I don't see anything ugly in there on the mirror in a dark recovered area. And over here, it's gotten just ever so slightly rougher, but still extremely clean. Now, it's between 4 and 5 stops where I finally see any kind of real evidence of underexposure issues. And so here you can see, it's completely lost. And so we're recovering, but you can see just a little bit of color banding, discoloration places that are there, blotches in the grip there of the SLR. If we look down in this area, we can see not only is it looking a little bit rougher, but also there's some evidence to me that looks like some smoothing that's being done by the sensor to help to correct for it. I'm not a big fan of that, but you can see that it's somewhere between 4 and 5 stops that things start to fall apart. And here you can just see that we got some kind of magenta color discoloration here. So it's just not a flawless recovery there. So in terms of highlight recovery here, this is at 2 stops of overexposure. You can see that that is a very obviously overexposed image. We can see looking up here in the swatches that we're recovering colors quite nicely over on this side. Things that have been lost, some of these shades of gray, and then also some of these colors that have been brought back. The front of the timer face looks, it's not like banded or blotchy. It looks good. And then we can see in areas that would have been kind of blown out spots where texture has been lost, texture has been regained just fine. That's a good result there. Now we can see if we move on to 3 stops of overexposure, it's just a little bit beyond what the sensor is able to do. It's not a complete loss, but we can see that we haven't gained back all of the proper color from the front of this. There's a little bit of some blown out areas here where texture hasn't come back. There still looks good, but there's a few places here, like for example right there, where you can it just doesn't quite look right. Probably in a critical situation, you could get away with this in some situations, but you can see that there are some colors that have been lost and have not really come back there. And, so example, we had the color here before, we've lost that now. If you move on to the 4 stops of overexposure, you can see it is a complete lost cause, even after trying to pull things back. Lots of colors gone, lots of textures gone. There's hot spots everywhere, and it just has a completely unnatural look to it. So you can almost get 3 stops, not quite. I would say you get probably 2.5 stops cleanly of a highlight recovery. So that adds up to a pretty good result that is better than many, many Canon cameras and also cameras from other brands. Not quite at Canon's very best level. But for some real-world observations, here's an image, obviously, where a lot of the sky had been blown out here. I was able to recover that very cleanly and able to just, dial in also a little bit of kind of deepening of the black levels. And so as a byproduct, we've got a much better looking image after recovery, other than, there were some snowflakes that were in the air. I was wondering where these spots are coming from. You can see a little bit more over here. Yeah, it was snowing as I took this shot, but you can see that it has recovered quite nicely there. One final image. This one is not quite technically perfect. You can see a little bit of junk here, and that is partly, yes, some snow in the air, but also the bigger thing is that I was shooting through a window, and it was not completely clean, let's just say. But what I want to point out here is that we've got lots of information everywhere that could recover in the shadows there, and then here in the highlights to where I could pull out some drama in what was a blown out sky to begin with. And just in general, as you look throughout the image, lots of detail, a good dynamic range, a good recovery that allows me to produce a dynamic image out of just one frame there. So where things get even better is when we talk about the high ISO performance. Again, looking at a base exposure here, we'll jump right to 1600. So base exposure, ISO 1600, we can see looking here that, it looks, in terms of the milkiness there and the shadows, it looks very, very good, very clean. No apparent noise here at 3200. Looking in the color swatches, they also look nice and clean. Overall, it is a really great looking result. Between 1600 and 3200, we see that things continue to hold up really well. Textures and contrast looks good. Shadow area looks clean. As we look along here on the tabletop, we can see that there's really no visible noise. If what is there is just so fine that it's never going to be an issue. From 3200 to 6400, this is typically where you start to see the image start to erode. But here, other than a little bit of very fine noise, it's still looking really, really clean. No color blotching or banding. Looking up here in our swatches, they look nice and clean. Shadows are still nice and inky. Jumping on up to 12,800, you can see looking at it globally that the image looks basically the same. There's no color shift. And so you can see the noise is intensifying some, but it's still just a very fine grain there. It's nothing ugly about it. We're not yet seeing any kind of hot pixels really that are messing up the shadows. And so we still have a decent looking contrast looking at the image overall. If we take a step further up to 25,600, once again looking at it globally, that's certainly an image you would use and not be too concerned about. If we jump in and look at a pixel level, you can see that the noise is getting a little bit rougher. You can see there on the mirror of the SLR, if we look down here, it's getting to a place where, you would start to debate whether or not you could use that. There is starting to be some, hotter pixels up here that makes it not quite as black in terms of the shadows. But again, at a global level, if you weren't needing to crop deeply into an image, you could obviously still get away with that. I would argue that in some situations, you might even still get away with 51,200, particularly if it's a situation where you don't need amazing contrast. Now you can see we are starting to get some patterning that's going on out there. I would certainly not prefer to use 51,200, but at the same time, I can't say that the image is completely fallen apart. There might be applications, editorial style, where you could still get, a decent shot out of that. Now, typically at the very end of the range, in this case, the native range runs through 102,400, which is higher than usual. And you can see that at this point, there are so many kind of hot pixels in the shadow area that shadows are toast. But what I will commend this for, I wouldn't use this image here on the right, but I will say this. I also don't see a major color shift, which I very often do at the end of ISO ranges to where the image just looks like complete garbage. That's not the case here. Again, I wouldn't prefer to use it, but at the same time, the colors are still relatively natural. It hasn't gone a big shift towards green or magenta. The shadows are really where things are garbage, but you can also see that the noise pattern is not terrible, and again, that color shift has stayed true. So that's really something very admirable about this sensor. I took this shot just kind of testing low light performance for autofocus, and what you can see here is this is 25,600. That's a really, really clean real-world result right there. I mean, again, I would say that is a completely usable image right there. We don't have a lot of really dark shadows where some of the noise shows up more. And so as a byproduct, I'm pretty impressed by that end result. Likewise here, also shooting into my cabinet, which has a lot of shadows. Obviously, I'm shooting into a lens cabinet. It's dark, and it's, black lenses and a black interior. So not a great situation. And here where you got all of that dark area, you can see some of that, kind of swirl pattern that's in that. In terms of the actual subjects, though, I mean, there's still a lot of detail there. The noise is very acceptable on those. And so, again, I'm pretty impressed with the high ISO performance. This is one of the best that I have seen.
So as you can see, the Canon EOS R6 Mark II is a very well-rounded camera that does pretty much everything well. Would I have preferred a higher resolution point? Absolutely. I would have loved to see something around 30 megapixels. I think it would have been an absolute home run at that point. But at the same time, there are some very clear advantages here relative to the competition for the R6 Mark II. I would say that it does a much better job of impersonating a sports camera than what its competing cameras will do. And while there is some give and take maybe in some areas, if you're looking for something that can capture fast action, something that'll work really well for sports or for wildlife, birds in flight, things like that, I think that this is a very intriguing option. It's a lot of camera for this particular price tier, and so I think for a certain audience, it is going to be a very attractive option. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's also linkage there to an image gallery if you would like to look at photos a little bit closer. There are some buying links there if you'd like to purchase, linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to get channel merchandise. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.